Good morning, folks. Hello. Great to see you. I'm going to share with you today. Uh, we're going to carry on our theme of adoption, but I'm going to actually look at it from the letter of Philippians, which Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. So, if you're ready, we'll get going. Just a quick recap. Over the last few days, Joshua and I hope, have shown you that adoption is a really big theme in the New Testament. It's the climax of the Christian experience. It's our highest blessing. As someone once put it, if you want to judge how well a person understands Christianity, find out how much he makes of the thought of being God's child and having God as his father. It's not surprising, therefore, if adoption is such a big theme in the New Testament, that you're going to find it coming up again and again as you read through your New Testament. Adoption, God as our Father, us as his sons, it's a recurring theme throughout the New Testament. I challenge you to read through the New Testament and see if it's not there in pretty well every book. Now, on Sunday, I spoke from the book of Philippians. And the question is this theme there in this letter? Now, I'm not going to pretend that adoption is the controlling metaphor in the letter of Philippians, but it is there. And I'll show you in just a minute. But let me just remind you a little bit of what's happening in Philippi. Remember how Paul visited Philippi. It was his first European city and the first European city church plant that he established. And we read in Acts 16 that the church got off to a flying start. Paul initially had a vision which led him to the city of Philippi. And then when he got there, he found some women down at the riversides gathered. He shared the gospel with them. God opened a lady called Lydia's heart, and then Lydia opened her home, and they started a church there. And there were some miracles that took place whilst Paul was in Philippi. There was a fortune-telling, demon-possessed slave girl who was healed. There was a time that following that when Paul was in prison, and there was an earthquake in the middle of the night, and he was released, and the jailer and his family were saved and baptized. And Paul stayed in Philippi and taught and encouraged these new baby Christians for a little while before he carried on his journeys. But before he left, he received from the church in Philippi a generous financial gift, further proof that their faith was a genuine saving faith that had changed their lives. They were truly born again. They were truly newborn children of God. But of course, Paul then carried on his travels around the Mediterranean and ended up in prison, in lockdown. The apostle to the Gentiles, who was called to travel the world with the good news, is put in lockdown by God. He's there in prison. It reminded me of how we've got 4 new chickens at the moment. And thankfully, they're just about starting to lay eggs, which is great news. But these chickens are very good at flying. And we've got a fence that encloses them in a certain part of the garden to stop them destroying the rest of the garden. But they've learnt how to fly over the fence and to get into the rest of the garden. And so Elsie and I the other day had to clip their wings and so that they can't fly. And if they try to, they'll just go around in circles because you only clip one wing. And now they have to stay in their enclosure. They're in lockdown, and all they can do is wander around in quite a nice enclosure and lay eggs. And it seems as if God had kind of clipped the Apostle Paul's wings so that he couldn't fly anymore, although he was designed to fly. But instead, he was put in lockdown in an enclosure, and all he could do was stay there in prison, if you like, and lay gospel eggs. For example, write this letter to the Philippians, which we're reading today, which is full of the gospel. But whilst Paul is there in prison, he receives a further gift of money from the church in Philippi. They haven't forgotten about him. They've heard about him in prison. They've sent him a generous gift sent by one of their own, Epaphroditus, who arrives at jail with Paul in Ephesus, gives him the money, and tells him the news of how the guys are doing back in Philippi. Paul is deeply moved by their gift, and he hears news from Epaphroditus about how these new Christians are doing, and some of the good, some of the bad, some of the ugly. There's a bit of disunity amongst them. Euodia and Syntyche have fallen out, but on the whole, the church is doing well. And so Paul picks up his pen and he writes this letter. And I'm going to read to you some verses from chapter 2 and verse 12. See if you can spot the reference to children of God. In Philippians 2, verses 12 to 16, it says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault, in a crooked and perverse generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold out the words of truth. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain." So there it is. In verse 15, he talks about these Christians and how they are children of God. And unlike their moaning, complaining, groaning, childish contemporaries, they are to act like pure and blameless children of God. They're to be mature Christians, mature children of God who shine like stars in the universe. And Paul says to them, just as you've always obeyed me when I was with you, now in my absence, while I'm not with you, I want you to continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It's like Paul is saying, like mature children, I want you to take responsibility for yourselves. I can't be with you right now. I can't hold your hands. I can't spoon feed you. You need to become self taught, self motivated, and to grow up whilst I'm absent from you. Elsewhere in Philippians, Paul talks about how he wants them as Christians to make progress in their faith, about how he wants them to act as mature believers, about how he wants them to forget what's behind and to press on to higher things, to keep moving forward, to keep growing up. And Paul says that this is to happen even though he's not with them right now, in his absence. Jesus talked about how the master would leave talents with his servants and then go away and expect them to take responsibility for the talents they were given, but that he would come back to see how they had done with those talents. But whilst he's away, they're expected to make progress. And Paul, interestingly, in Colossians 3, and this is also repeated in Ephesians, in Colossians 3 and verse 22, and this is for all you guys out there who are going to be working today from home, including myself. He says in Colossians 3:22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. So there's that principle there that ultimately it's between us and God, and whether our pastor is present with us or whether our employer, our boss is present with us is kind of irrelevant, because we need to be self-motivated and take responsibility for ourselves and work for God. Do it for God as a reward for Him. That means that there's no pressure to perform and impress because He's already pleased with you. But from that place of knowing His pleasure, you can serve Him wholeheartedly, whether your boss is there or not. And Paul says to these Philippians, whilst I, your apostle, am absent, I want you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. He doesn't say, I want you to earn your salvation. Of course, Jesus has already done that for us. But now I want you to work out what your salvation means for you in your life. I want you to take responsibility for your own maturity, for your own growth, for your own learning, for your own living. I want you to work out that salvation means you should be united with one another, Euodia and Syntyche. Get your relationship sorted out. I want you to work out what this means for you in your everyday life. But he says to them, it is God who is working in you to will and act according to his good will and purpose. And so the great thing is, Paul says, although I'm not able to be with you right now, God is with you right now, and he's working in you, and therefore he will help you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. But just to finish, Paul says at the end of this, I will be with you again. I am confident that I will come to be with you again. We will all be together. I long to be with you with the affections of Christ, with the entrails of Christ, he says earlier on. I wish that I could be with you, but one day I know that I will be again, not just in heaven, but actually I'm confident that God is going to release me from this lockdown so that we can all be together again. He says it in chapter 1, verse 25. He says, I'm convinced that I will remain on the earth and continue with you for your progress and joy in the faith. And very explicitly in chapter 2, verse 24, he says to them, I am convinced in the Lord that I myself will come soon. Paul is sure that he is going to be released from prison, that his time of lockdown will end, that he will be free to fly again as an apostle. This season will pass, and they will once again be reunited and able to carry on with their life as before, but different as well, because during this time of lockdown, they will have grown up, they will have learned. And so Paul says, in the meantime, I want you to make the most of this opportunity to learn, to grow, to demonstrate your faith, to be strong. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. As elders, we've been praying for the church. We even met last night to pray together for all of us as church members. And we felt that God was encouraging us to believe that all of us are going to grow and be refined and come out of this time more mature, more able to serve God, more effective and more fruitful, because we will have learnt the lessons during this period that we're in right now. And so let me encourage you today to continue to grow as a child of God, to enjoy your adoption as his son, enjoy him as your father. And let me finish with this prayer which Paul prays in Philippians 1 and verse 8. This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Lord, I pray that for all of us, that we may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, that we may grow in our understanding of you during this time, that you get our heads into a good book, that you get our hearts into a good prayer time, that you would just help us, oh God, to discern what is best, be pure and blameless. Lord, help us to be filled with the fruit of righteousness. For your glory and praise, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you very much for joining me. God bless you. I'm going to go and make Kate a birthday breakfast now. And yeah, I wish you all the best. See you soon.